Hi, guys. Welcome to another edition of the podcast. My name is Mike. I'm joined by Paul Hendler and Morgan Pillay. We are part of an organization called Stellenbosch Transparency. It's a brand new podcast that we're starting. The format is essentially news analysis. So what we do is we take some contemporary news articles and we analyze them based on a topic. And this week's topic is land invasions. Quite a hot topic in South Africa, and it has been for quite a while, and it seems like it is speeding up as time goes on. Morgan, how are you today?
Well, colleagues, hope you're doing well. I think this topic has to be centered around the history of South Africa. And I think the issue of land invasions cannot be seen in isolation, because we come out of a society that's been unequal for a very long time, with many disparities. And over the last 20 years, we haven't seen that these disparities and unequalness being addressed. And therefore, the pressures on land has become enormous, particularly from the point of view of human settlements. So I think this means that we have to start to make compromises so that we give opportunities for those that do not have the means to buy, the means to rent, but want to see themselves as entry into the urban market, entry into urban jobs, etc., and to provide that opportunity. If we don't, using the current trajectories, we're going to continue to see land invasions, particularly in urban areas, and we're going to see the number of informal settlements rise dramatically over the next few years. So I think this historic context means that we as landowners, government policymakers, have to make substantial compromises to make sure that these needs and human requirements are dealt with in a sensitive way. And I think particularly, we'll come back to the point of policy and how one deals with policy. But I think just bringing everybody on the same platform on an equal footing regarding access to land, ownership, access to human settlements, and making sure that the Constitution talks about access to the right to land, and I think one needs to give effect to that in a real way.
I see Paul's just shot off there. Paul, thanks, Morgan. That's I think that's a great intro into the discussion. Paul, how are you today?
I'm doing very well, Mike. And how are you?
Yeah, not bad. Thank you.
Good,
not bad.
good.
Thank you very much. So what we've done for this particular discussion, and I think possibly for further discussions, is we have selected a couple of news articles to kind of keep the discussion contemporary and fresh, and South African-based news articles, obviously. And the key word that we've used was land invasion. I think Morgan's intro has really kind of highlighted where we are, and I think it was a good start to get us into the discussion. Paul, the news articles that we analyzed spoke a lot about the anti-land invasion units. They act in quite a brutal kind of fashion, right? Of what I can see in the reports. My question, and possibly you can answer it, and Morgan, you can come in if you can or want to. The Red Ants, are they a private security operation, or are they government funded?
My understanding is that the Red Ants are a private operation, and that they are hired on an outsourced basis by private and public authorities to actually effect evictions from people who are unlawfully occupying property.
Yeah. So I mean, this is a big issue to the fiscus. I mean, large amounts of capital are used on an annual basis. I mean, you've seen examples in the Western Cape, Gauteng, where properties are being protected from land invasions, and huge amounts of money have been spent to protect these properties. So, you know, the big question is, why not use these monies to produce the kind of settlements or land that people can settle on, and start, you know, give them a reasonable start to life. So I think for me, that's a big question. Why are we, you know, devoting so much of resources into something that we know is unjustifiable given the policy context?
Yeah, it's so interesting because I think we'll get to that later in the discussion, because there's definitely a point on how much money is getting spent on the so-called prevention of these land invasions. Just to stay on the point of the anti-land invasion units, you know, the name, even the name Red Ants, is quite provocative, right? It's you know, it doesn't quite give a good feeling on this, and what they're doing obviously is it certainly doesn't create any sort of cohesion in the community. But my concern is that if the Red Ants are a private security company, I believe the city of Cape Town also has their own anti-land invasion units. Is that correct?
Yeah, sorry. Within municipalities, you have anti-land invasion units. They're very small, but their role is really to detect where land invasion is taking place, come back, report, and then obviously, depending on the scale of what's happening, the municipalities would deploy or engage the Red Ants en masse to be able to do those evictions. Like you say, these things happen brutally. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, I would assume there's some sort of legislation, and I'm not expecting everyone on this call to know the legislation. Maybe we can make assumptions, and maybe it's something we can look at later. But I'm trying to understand what authority is given to these private security companies to literally go and even harass seems like a milder word to what they appear to be doing. You know, what would there be legislation that gives these ALIUs authority to do this, to do these kind of things? I mean, sorry, before you answer that, I mean, just based on some news articles that we had a look at, and I'm basing this on the reports from the communities, right, where gardens were being destroyed, where women were being shot at by these anti-land invasion units. You know, it almost appears like a war zone. And I'm trying to understand, if they are a private security company, you know, what are their, you know, who is keeping them under control? I mean, as I said, I don't expect you to have a firm answer. It's just an interesting question, because I mean, the Human Rights Commission starts talking about some sort of illegalities, but I don't know if you possibly have some insight as to how these private security companies are essentially regulated.
Morgan, do you want to chip in on that? Because I think you have been in one metro municipality or close to it yourself, and maybe you've got some insight into that question.
Yeah, a little bit. I think that these private security companies, particularly dealing with land invasions, are not well regulated. Certainly, the kind of people that are sent out are not au fait with how to treat people, how to read a situation on the ground and react appropriately. Mike, the legality of this, you know, is really based in the court system that we have in the country. I mean, really, when a court issues a court order for an eviction, this means that you, as the private landlord or the metropolitan municipality that owns the land, have the right to evict using that means. But that doesn't make it a fair system, because I think behind this, there's a whole lot going on why this is happening. And I think just sending out the red ants to evict people is just a temporary solution. It's not a permanent solution to this problem. And I think we're going to see from time to time that people will continue to reinvade the land, and the landowners will just feel helpless about the situation. So we've got to, I think, take a few steps back and look deeply at why this is, what's causing this and how one deals with this. So Paul, that's my response. Yeah, it's a bit technical, but sure. I think that's how the property owners respond to this.
Yes, yeah, makes sense. Yeah, what you say, I agree with you.
Well, on that point, then we can look at how the Human Rights Commission has responded, and the reports that we're seeing on their response. Morgan, you mentioned the need for a court order, right? So my understanding is that a complaint gets made, it has to be investigated and assessed. It then has to go to the courts. The courts then need to rule on it, and then an official court order gets delivered. And at that point, then it's free game, right? Then the ALIUs can come in and do whatever they want. And as you say, I mean that presents quite problematic issues. Paul, I think in our experience, we've kind of seen how the courts operate, right? When it comes to say more marginalized communities, and there's a lot to be lacking there when it comes to procedures, right? What it appears that the Human Rights Commission is arguing is that these ALIUs, anti-land invasion units, are mandated to demolish structures without needing a court order, which essentially then is illegal, right? And if that is the case, there should be some sort of accountability. What I found interesting, though, reading these reports, is that there's a issue here called counter spoliation, something I haven't heard before, but what that means is that when a dispossessed owner immediately and forcibly takes back possession of their property, the anti-land invasion units then react as well, okay? And this has been used to justify, demolition of structures and removal of land occupiers without getting a court order. And the Human Rights Commission has argued that this is a way to circumvent the provisions of the PI Act. And in a way, it seems like that could also be used as a implicit tactic, because if you think about that issue on the ground, the heated emotional issue that would be, your structure has just been demolished, you're now reacting in maybe a violent way. There's a counter reaction again. That kind of heated moment is being used now to circumvent the law. That appears to be what the Human Rights Commission is arguing. I don't know if you guys have got any thoughts on that kind of thing.
Well, the one thought I have, and maybe Morgan, you can clarify this because I think you're closer to this issue than I am, is that if you erect an informal structure and it's detected, they've got something like 48 hours from the moment you've erected it to demolish it. Whoever they is I presume the owner of the property, be it public or private, without having to get a court order. But once you have been there for 48 hours, even if you're there illegally, it has to go through a judicial procedure. Is that correct, or do you know anything about that?
Well, Paul, the 48 hours, I think, is just a practice. But in reality, I think in most cases, you would need a court order, to make this legal. And I think that's how the red ants are able to get away with a lot of the abuses that have taken place. It's it's just not a fruitful way of dealing with the issue of land invasions. Again, I think the amount of resources being spent annually is just being misdirected.
Well, let's actually move on to that. Although, the PI Act is also something interesting that we can maybe talk about at a later stage, because that's essentially there to kind of, give some sort of right to the dispossessed individual or family. But Morgan, you now mentioned about the money that's getting spent, and that certainly came up in these reports, right? Hell of a lot of money spent on so-called preventing of these illegal land invasions. One report in the Western Cape government said that they had spent 355 million, right? Over 1,000 attempted land invasions across the Western province. My question then is, what is this money spent on? When they say that 355 million is spent on preventing illegal land invasions, what is the money spent on, and how is this money allocated? Would you have some insight there?
Yeah, well, look, this is allocated to private companies, security companies, to protect land that's been identified as core to the development planning work of the local governments, and also private companies and landowners also spend huge amounts of money to protect these properties. So that's the one aspect. The other aspect is when land has been invaded and you now appoint the red ants, these are now cost huge amounts of money to have maybe 500-600 people on the ground to evict people, move the physical structures, which may take 2, 3, 4 days, and also maybe provide protection for that property in the next week or so that the land is not re-invaded. So that's primarily where the money is being utilized.
355 million, that's a lot. And I think that was, I don't have the exact time span here, but I think that was over a time span of a year. And my concern is, it's where my mind goes to, that, preventing of land invasion is quite lucrative, right? Quite a lucrative business to be in, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Governments are budgeting for land invasions, which this is the level of ridiculousness we're getting into. And that money, can be used elsewhere to build many units and obviously service land that can be made available in the right locations. So I think that whole aspect of budgeting for the protection of land, one has to look at it. And obviously we need to be able to communicate with our communities to say, look, this is the kind of trade-off we're looking at.
Now, that's interesting, that communication, and maybe we'll get to that a bit later. So what I'm hearing from you, and what certainly came out in the reports, and and I would see them as the arguments, the government's strongest arguments, right? That all these resources that were being allocated to anti-land invasion units could be spent and allocated to the delivery of housing opportunities, right? Which they say are now delayed for months and even years. And I think you would certainly agree with that. And I think we could all agree with that, right? Although the implementation of in our experience of what we've looked at, implementation of housing projects, certainly come with the own problems as well, right? The other thing that was mentioned in the report, which I also thought was interesting, right? That invaded land parcels are sometimes not suitable for housing developments, right? So my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, that if a piece of land is identified, maybe it was different back in the day where communities were able to identify their own land, right? And start communities on them. Maybe that has changed slightly now, where the government is now very much allocating land out. And maybe there's some disadvantages and advantages to a community choosing a piece of land or the government allocating a piece of land. But maybe we can talk about this quickly. The land that is not suitable for housing development, that may be either too small or lie on floodplains or face other factors which make development of housing opportunities impractical and possibly put people at risk. How do we think about something like that? And essentially, I don't think we've decided whether we support land invasions or not. However, I think we can take into consideration, a certain community possibly seeing a piece of land and choosing to invade that land. How do we handle a situation where that land is simply not suitable for human inhabitation?
Yeah, that's quite a difficult point, particularly, one needs to have the technical facts about why that particular piece of land is not habitable. Now, you would see, particularly in floods in Germany and so on, well-established communities, houses have been washed away. And that's based on a flood frequency of, I think, 1 in 75, 1 in 100 years. So planners do know that these are risks, but I think some of these risks can be mitigated to better planning, building of better structures that can withstand some of these natural climatic issues. But there's other issues. For example, the south of Johannesburg, most of it is dolomitic. But in the last 20 years, we haven't seen any big landslides or sinkholes, appear. So obviously, I think the authorities need to do the work and need to understand exactly what the risks are, so that we can explain to communities what those risks are and how they can be addressed. I mean, obviously, if the risk of technical failure is very high, then that land would not be suitable. But I think this is the kind of information that must be available so that you can have this conversation. The current level of conversation is the land is not conducive for human development, and that's the rhetoric that's being spread without any facts and without any proper research behind it. So I think that's what we see in the public domain, and if we can improve that, and also land is a scarce commodity, and I think through the modern planning techniques and building structures, one can build homes and dwellings that are more resilient to the environment. And I think that's what communities are arguing. What is it that the state or the authorities are doing to make the land habitable?
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, Mike, if I could just come in here, I think what we're talking about needs to be contextualized in terms of a class struggle over housing shortages and the different conflicting narratives that are related to the metropolitan authorities in the case of these articles, and what we know, what you can tease out from the articles, because they don't actually tell you much about the points of view of the land invaders. But what I'm really getting at is that you have a narrative that is very focused on privatization, commercialization, and that tends to criminalize land invasions, which, in pure legal terms, it is that. But going back to Morgan's point about the context behind the breaking of the law on private property, it's simply disingenuous to sort of refer to it, as we hear from quite a lot of these metropolitan municipal officials, about the scourge, the criminal scourge, of land invasion. So I think what you have here is two very deeply conflicting narratives that reflect a sort of governmental or governance system that is very, very strongly, I would say even dogmatically, committed to privatization, commercialization of property and services, and then people who are struggling against that because it doesn't work for them. And many of them, I think, are savvy enough. This is what I got out of partly our own research in years gone by in Stellenbosch and the invasion of this land that's now been called Azania on the edge of the Papagaaieberg near me, but also from reading between the lines of some of these articles, that a lot of the land that people take, they actually are quite savvy about the land being above a flood line, reasonably well drained, on a hill, and they're actually very well organized in terms of their strategy for taking that land and occupying it in great numbers quite quickly to make it a fait accompli, and then erecting structures which I think shows an organized supply chain that links backward into both the formal and the informal private sector that produces these modules, of zinc, because not all the informal structures are second-hand old pieces of zinc and wood that has been picked up individually. You often see very shiny pieces that have been produced, and there's obviously a trade going on there. So I think I want to just bring us back to that type of point. It's a bit of a political economy point, and the problem that we have is that the narratives are intensely conflicting rather than engaging. And from my experience of working with the authorities, they seem to be very, what's the word? They seem to be very, maybe dogmatic is the word, dogmatically wedded to certain principles rather than, if you take an approach in medicine, are you sort of committed to pharmaceuticals in laboratory, or do you also look at the clinical history of your patient? And if you start getting into a particular community, its particular history, then you're going to have to work around some of these principles and stop being dogmatically committed to them and negotiate a solution. Okay, and negotiations are not the order of the day anymore. They were at one stage. But at that stage, I think the communities were in a far stronger position socially and politically. And at the moment, what I'm picking up is that they've come out of a relatively disempowered period, but they're now empowering themselves, because what I took away from reading these articles, which quotes quite a lot of municipal managers from the Cape Town Metropole and the eThekwini Metropole, the Johannesburg Metropole, the Gauteng and the Western Cape Provincial Housing Human Settlement Departments, is that notwithstanding these hundreds of millions of rand that are being spent in the Western Cape, and I presume elsewhere, they are possibly containing the problem at best. And it's probably getting incrementally worse. They're probably losing ground. And so you're getting an empowerment on the ground, which maybe is a positive thing, because it strikes me as a highly organized crowd of people who can actually do that. I mean, imagine the three of us suddenly being dumped in that situation with our families. I mean, I think I might die before I got my act together to actually lead something like that or even contribute to it. So I think in such a situation where the metropolitan municipalities are not actually, they're sort of running on a treadmill, maybe they're going to realize that out of necessity, they're going to have to be more flexible and start looking at the creative side of what these people are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Paul, you used the word negotiation, and I think as South Africans, we need to renegotiate what a South African city is supposed to look like, or what do we want it to look like, and taking into account all the different dimensions, the different typologies of buildings, formal, informal, your multi-million rand buildings, and how this all works together within the context of a city. And that's the kind of cohesiveness you want to see that would represent an African city. Unless we have this myopic view that the city should look as only with like formalized buildings that meets a particular standard that you and I as Westerners understand. So I think that kind of shift is a deep shift, and we need to negotiate that to arrive at a fair solution.
I mean, just to continue on that point at a more technical level, possibly, if I can use that word, and I actually want to use an example, this place called Azania, which is over the hill from where I'm sitting now, which was, and Morgan, I knew you were talking, and Mike, I think we were also talking about it at the time. There was an invasion of a private farmer's land, and that land invasion was very rapid. I mean, that land invasion got literally hundreds of these shiny, and I've seen these informal shacks. They're definitely the shiny metal modules that have been produced somewhere by somebody. They're not old pieces that individuals have hammered together. They're modularized, okay? There were hundreds that went up there within the space of 4 or 5 days. Now, your Stellenbosch municipality, if it delivers 200, 250 or 300 houses in a year, is doing very well. This place has probably got, I don't know, close to 1,000, maybe, I could be wrong at the moment. And we're talking a couple of years on. And it was an initiative driven by a community organization on the ground, the leader of which, interestingly, was a member of an independent grouping, a member of the council a couple of years before that, quite a few couple of years before that. And so he was actually very experienced in council politics as well as on the ground politics. So I think there's for me, there's an element of serious organization around material class issues here that is actually quite creative. And unfortunately, in the story that I'm telling you, the owner of the land lost his life shortly after all this happened, and there were a lot of fingers pointed at the community leader. His name was Mr. Wanana, and his group. But it transpired later that he was taken out in a hit that had absolutely nothing to do with these people. And Mr. Wanana himself, in fact, publicly expressed grief at the death of this man and the loss to his family. And Mike, my and your sort of contact with some of the activists in some of the other townships in Stellenbosch around informal backyard dwellings, which is another form of, it's a different form of irregular informal housing on land. It's not exactly the same as a free settlement, but there are a lot of similarities there. Has shown us how difficult it is for people to get the basic shelter they need and to raise their families, but also how hard they work around that issue and channel a lot of their anger in ways that are actually quite creative and very different to the looting that we witnessed, recently, which is very frightening. Okay, so I think these developments that these few articles have actually indicated are also holding a positive potential. It could go either way, but I do think that the the elites in the metropolitans and the political elites, and also in the provinces and at government national level, need to also see things in a different way in order to make this process be more creative and less conflict and less destructive. Because I don't want to romanticize it either. I think it's got enormous destructive potential in it, and and the risks of that are enormous, I think, also. So I think it's a challenge to try and get these ideas through to the elites also, because I'm not always sure how in touch they are with these dynamics.
Yeah, I think you both raised some very interesting points here, and I must say, Paul, your take on conflicting narratives. I was reflecting as you guys were talking about, especially the narrative of building on land that isn't sufficient, or and then I kind of got struck by just what you said, Paul, when it comes to, I think sometimes the authorities don't, or the narrative is that they don't accept that the people are actually quite capable, right? Mm. And it could be because whatever reason they're seeing it from that point. But I think the opposite is clearly true, because of what you described now, the kind of organization on the ground that can happen very quickly. It takes a capable group of people to do that, right? Even the structures that were built at Kreefgat. Now, Kreefgat, for those that don't know, was a settlement in Stellenbosch that Paul and I had involvement in. The structures that were built there were quite advanced for what could be considered informal structures, right? Which kind of told me that a group of people that have the right intention and have the incentive can certainly achieve what appears to be way more than government authorities. I just have to say it like that, right? So how do I think we've made notes here about the backlog in the Western Cape, 600,000. That sounds to me a lot, but it still sounds to me like there's probably more than that, right? And we're sitting on a backlog of 600,000, and what was also coming from the reports was that the people are actually now hut full of waiting for houses, and I can understand. I mean, there were some reports of people waiting as far back as 1997. There's probably people that have waited even longer. So I think we've got to the point now where people are actually just over houses. They're at the point now where it says, just give us the land and we'll build our own houses. I mean, what do you guys think about that idea? It's thinking lightly about it, I think that's probably quite a good idea. But how when it comes to the technical aspects of formal structures, how do you guys think that idea could be kind of developed into allowing the communities to build their own houses on maybe allocated land, but still keep those houses in a fashion that are formal, semi-formal, or in a fashion that isn't wouldn't put them at harm or the community in general at harm?
Yeah, I think that's the way that it's going to proceed, with government support and guidance and facilitation, or without. And I think the role that government can play here is really to open up and start this channel of communication with communities and with potential people that wanting to acquire a piece of land and build on it incrementally. Because again, it's the previous state-driven process just shows us that it's been slow, hamstrung by bureaucracy, and at the end, it doesn't deal with the actual requirements and needs of the communities. So actually, communities will tell you, where they would like housing, where they would like the land to be located, and they would tell you about the services, and use that as the basis upon which you can plan. But in addition to just providing land and building on an incremental basis, I think the state should be also looking at rental housing, particularly in the urban centers, and expanding that quite rapidly, so that those that want to take advantage of that would be possible. And I think the policy that talks to adequate shelter, within the Constitution needs to be, looked at in terms of its definition. And we talked about earlier, formal versus informal, and there should be an understanding and a description of exactly what that means, so that there's a common understanding. But there should also be the basis that if you are given a piece of land, you can only build what you can afford at that point in time. That doesn't mean to say over the period of time, you can't improve it to a point that meets some minimum standards. So I think there has to be that combination, and that combination will also include the consultation of those communities that live in well-established areas, the so-called high income areas, and negotiate these parts where we need to integrate these communities with the local environments. I think also trying to push them to the periphery is also a problem. It creates a technical problem of transport and job opportunities, and I think that's a big consideration, and I think it's probably another injustice that we do from a planning perspective.
Yeah, interesting. I had some thoughts now as you were. Oh yes, just the thought that came to me. You're talking about informal housing versus formal housing, and how, and an individual or a family can only build what they can possibly afford. Wouldn't it be possible for government resources to be focused on material then? Like, what is the kind of material that it takes to build a structure? And once again, I think we underestimate, even us, even me, underestimate the capabilities of people that want to build a structure. I think there would be a higher percentage of individuals or families or groups that have the capability to build structures if they give quite good structures if they're given access to materials. So it's something that I thought about way back when me and Paul were looking at stuff, but it's come to my mind again now. Morgan, what do you think about Morgan and Paul? What do you think about that? Like moving resources into providing materials? Would that be plausible? Has the government looked at that at all?
Well, they're looking at it from a proposal that we've put on the table in our work for them regarding buying materials or securing discounts in bulk to get materials into areas where there are informal backyard dwellings, which you've been exposed to, Mike, in the research here, so that those Wendy houses, which are many of them what they are, can be at least insulated for a limited cost and improve the quality of life. But also it goes beyond just materials. It also goes to the resources to enable the materials. So the type of proposals we put on the table were for a government housing bank that could actually make affordable loans available for the owners of these backyard dwellings, those properties, to actually purchase insulation material to upgrade these informal structures. In this case, we were talking about Wendy houses, in fact. And then even before getting there, what we were looking at was an actual capital investment in the form of a government subsidy that would fund a slab on top of which you could put the Wendy house, and the slab would be service. It would have a sewer outlet, a potable water inlet, and an electrical connection. And it would be directly provided to the tenant for the tenant's account, and there would be a municipal rebate on the consumption costs depending on your income as a tenant. Okay, so all of that is important because government has an important role to play here in terms of funding the costs of some of these things, and subsidizing them. And government itself has got a fiscal limitation, as we know, especially now with the economic slowdown produced by the lockdown. So, and maybe I just want to make this point: you cannot really make proposals at the government level without moving into the macroeconomy and into the macro financing area, and addressing the question of where do you get bulk, cheap money for government to actually do this in the long run. And it takes you into an area of government-owned banks and government-created money, which is a different mindset, okay? And there's a lot that's been written on it, and it's even been applied in the US, which is not a popular place for government-created money as a philosophy, certainly. But in South Africa, our government, and in fact, the political parties generally, have not developed their mindset to include a public bank that creates money at zero interest to actually fund utilities and socially necessary services and development in the interest of economic development. It's not seen that way. It's a mindset that is very narrowly focused on privatization, and including the privatization of funding, because it's seen as being profit driven, and it's seen as being the most efficient and least wasteful of resources. And so you have a challenge in terms of ideologies or frameworks of seeing the world, that at an elite level, one needs to try and think how can that thinking change, and what are the triggers that might change it. And I'm suggesting that if there's an impasse on the ground with these land invasions, as I mentioned earlier, then maybe there's an opportunity for an upward filtering of that force in the form of ideas, to a very different way of thinking about macro financing. Because, I remember my ward councillor here, Johanni Sedane, who's on the MACO here, in a meeting where this was raised, possibly by me in a public meeting, with all these issues and what we could do for the backyard dwellers in Stellenbosch and redirecting funds and all that. She said, yeah, but where's the budget? Give me the answer to that question. Where do we find the money? So that's what you are, in a way, up against, and I think that's the challenge at the level of ideas. But I think the motive force for all of this is sitting on the ground. I think people like us are useful when that motive force hits the other one, and people start looking for new ideas to sort of break the impasse. At least that's what happened. That, in my understanding, that moved us from a authoritarian, undemocratic, exclusionary political system into what we have now, 25 years ago.
Yeah, so Mike, there's another component to the incremental building, and I do agree with you that homeowners can build by themselves. provided the state can shift the way in which it has been working, particularly at the local level, meaning that you now need to have extension officers that can go out on a daily basis and provide the advisory support to these home builders and guide them and on proper standards and maintaining minimum connections and infrastructure that's required. Similarly, we have national institutions that are mandated with the issue of standards and regulating standards. And I think they should also relinquish their head offices and join local communities and provide the ground level support that's required to build these communities. And that's the kind of model that is required here to work together with the financing that Paul talked about. And these are the kinds of shifts that we need to see in the policy and in the policy implementation, particularly for human settlements. And I think I want to emphasize the role of the local authorities here. It is critical. I think providing the standards and the advisory support is one area, but maintaining the infrastructure and making sure that the infrastructure is there and well maintained is another important role. And that means that our communities should acknowledge that and also play their part in the process of revenue collection and tariff structures that are put in place for communities moving forward.
Yeah, Mike, I just want to emphasize the point that Morgan's raised, because I think the municipalities, it's not just the local councils and the MACO, it's also the municipalities. It's the type of attitude or approach to the job, I mean, I go back to when the two of us met, Mike, around the eviction of some traders in the center of Stellenbosch, and the municipal officials who were basically destroying a very successful group of entrepreneurs who I think were able to provide, or some of them were able to provide an education for their children from the money that they were earning. And they even had enough capital saved up to fight what was being done to them through a not cheap legal advisor in the courts. And I think what struck us both at the time was the inability of the officials to engage in a sort of problem-solving, creative way. And yes, at one level they're carrying out instructions, but the municipal leadership is at a very high level, tied into through the municipal manager into the exco or the mayoral committee and the executive mayor. So I think the councils and the local government structure itself, as it currently works, is incompatible with what we're talking about. And I think the municipal structure is part of that problem also, the municipal officials. And part of it, it is not an easy, problem that you can put your finger on that and solve that and the rest falls in place. Like anything in reality, it's got multi-causal roots, okay? One of the other sort of roots of this problem is local politics, where again, I can speak from my own community in the suburb where I live, where there was quite a creative proposal, and I think you may be aware of this, Mike. There was quite a creative proposal to have a corridor development on the edge of our suburb here. It was called the Adam Tuss Corridor, and it was going to involve an integrated business, mixed development housing, but also social housing, right? Which is rented housing, not for the poorest of the poor, but what is called gap housing. People probably earning between 6,000 and 7,000 and 22,000 rand a month, okay? And this was actually being prosecuted or advocated by some progressive municipal managers. So they are there also. But they were hauled over the coals by our community, who had quite a few liberally minded people in the audience who were very, very concerned about the value of their properties, the price of their properties, and for good reason, because that's another factor in this systemic set of causes, that our properties are a major investment in all our lives, and they are the major factor in us being able to retire and live at a certain level, because they provide a accumulation of assets that we can sort of capitalize, sell our houses at a certain age, that's the theory at least, buy down into a cheaper place and have a couple of million or whatever, which you need more than a couple of million in the bank to draw the types of incomes that a lot of even lower middle income people, we're not talking about the top 1%, we're talking probably about the top 20% of the population who live in these suburbs. So they're under a lot of pressure and fear. And if you try and say, well, how would we address that, and you go deeper and deeper into the complex multi-causality of these issues, then you end up as one solution that, you need a national insurance scheme and a national public health scheme that actually would take the sting out of people's fears, because that you could go to a provider of health service provider, public or private, even a hospital, public or private, and there'd be enough in the scheme for you to actually have yourself treated for most issues. And likewise, on retirement, that the state pension would not be the type of close to bare survival and below that it is now. Now we're into a whole macroeconomic debate, okay, and I think it's very difficult to avoid that if you want to get a agreement and a negotiated agreement between suburbanites, the municipality, and the land invaders. Very difficult. So that's why I always revert to where is the major force going to come for this change, and it's coming from the land invaders, and I try and look at those who are the most creative and the least destructive at that level, and try and engage with them.
But Paul, the question is, if you're a wealthy property owner, and there's many of those in the country, of what value is that when there's high poverty levels, social unrest, crime is high, and you're having invasions happening around you? I think that's the context you got to balance, and those are the compromises we have to strike. And I think if we do indeed have a compromise that talks about how people get access to land and housing on a basis that represents their own aspirations, I think these kind of fears and the fear that your property will lose value would diminish.
Morgan, can I ask you a practical question, okay?
Good.
In Kyalami Estate, where you live, okay?
Yeah.
What would be the reaction of just people your neighbors, whoever you are or are not in touch with, to a development nearby, like the example I gave you here? Do you have any sense of what their reaction would be? Do you have any practical experience of talking to them about such an issue?
Well, there's been no experience about talking to them, but I know from some of their attitudes that they would be really hard-nosed about any low-income development close by.
Yeah.
But what's been very disappointing is that we've had some mixed development developments around the Kailami area.
Right.
But it didn't go deep enough
Right.
in terms of the income. And I think that was a disappointment for me, because it was an opportunity, and it was private developers together with the municipalities providing the bulk of the infrastructure.
Okay.
And certainly, I think it would have rubbed some of the people's nose, but I think
Yes.
it would have been something that people would have, would have embraced, having seen it work in reality.
Yes.
So I think there's some lost opportunities.
Yes.
And I think by having more examples where we can see this sort of integration inclusion, it probably would make people understand better, those that have hard views about this, that this is the best thing for South Africa.
I mean, it just strikes me that the type of video thing that we're producing and would like to obviously broadcast, and develop interest in, would be quite appropriately targeted at people who are typically your neighbors and Mike's neighbors. Because this grouping of suburbanites who are under their own type of economic pressure, I understand that and all of that, because I'm one of them, is a what's the word? Stakeholder, if you want to call another word. They can actually undermine the process also. So it's actually got to do with all of us, which I think is where you are heading to. Yeah, interesting sort of thought to reflect on, actually.
Yeah, I agree. I think a whole bunch of things were raised there once again. But if we're talking about the point of who are the stakeholders, obviously, everyone's a stakeholder at a certain degree. But when it comes to acceptance of certain developments that are actually required, and the compromise you talk about, Morgan, that's needed within everyone's almost their spirit in a way, right? Because I've living comfortably in my house there, and I look out the window and I see something going on there that I'm not too happy with. I think that's almost like a natural human kind of reaction, right? But at the same time, I think these kind of discussions, as small as this discussion is maybe, and as few ears that it gets to, I think are important to even for us, the three of us, even to kind of, start understanding that. I think that I like the point that you mentioned, Morgan, that what's the point of living in your nice space if the rest of the country is literally going down the tubes, right?
Exactly.
So I mean, I'm also in the space of my life now. I think COVID made it more complicated, where I was looking to go overseas and I was trying to analyze my intentions as to why I was wanting to do that, right? And I think COVID kind of settled that for me. And I thought I've got to kind of stay here and make it work. And at the same time, I've got experience with working with Paul and looking at these gated villages with their gated estates with their things, and not that I've got anything against that at all, but in Stellenbosch, Paul, it was a lot of that stuff was put on land that in a way it felt like that land belonged to the community. So there's a lot involved here, and what I'm getting at as I'm babbling on here is that I think it is important for people to understand that to make something work, there's going to be a compromise, right? And I think getting involved in your communities and your smaller communities and your wider communities to a certain degree is important. To at least for the individual to try and understand their surroundings, right? Because I think if you're not understanding your surroundings, things can get quite hairy, quite fast, and things can get quite dangerous quite fast, right? So there is a responsibility on each individual and citizen to a certain degree. I kind of bounce between this responsibility stuff. Sometimes I like to be completely independent, but then I also acknowledge that there has to be some sort of a responsibility to for the individual to kind of like ensure that their surroundings and those of others are at least trying to understand or compromise or empathize. So sorry, I babbled on a bit there, but those are the kind of thoughts that were coming to my mind as you guys were talking. And I think it's a very interesting discussion, guys. I think we're probably good to wrap now. I don't know if if we quickly want to each just wrap up on a point, if that's okay. Paul, I don't know if you want to go first.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I think the looting and the horrific destruction that looked like made parts of KwaZulu-Natal cities, Durban and Pietermaritzburg, look like war zones, and parts of Gauteng also. I think that has shocked a lot of people. And I think what we've been talking about now is a realistic and practical response to what, as individuals and more broadly communities and governments and municipalities, could start at least thinking about doing to break a mental sort of worldview logjam. Okay. And so I think that's a very positive contribution to being, progressive and creative rather than sort of reactionary and destructive, to the crisis that we are certainly in. And I think it's recognized by so many people when you listen to talk radio today, that there is this crisis that we're in. So I'm quite positive about the potential for having a positive impact by sharing, these types of ideas as widely as possible.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, Mike, my view is that I think particularly the poor and those that live in informal structures have been very patient in South Africa. I think that sort of patience is running out. And I think there needs to be a serious shift in the thinking, both in the citizenry, those that have resources, and also the state to be able to respond with programs. And I think the point that Paul raised earlier, looking at the funding mechanisms that can be brought to bear to make this a reality. I am also positive that we have the capacity, the knowledge, the technical skills to make this happen. And I think if we collectively work on this, I think we can certainly impact the current trajectory that we're seeing in terms of the response from the land invaders and those living in informal settlements.
Excellent. Thanks, Morgan. Well, guys, I think that was a extremely interesting and insightful conversation. And I think it would be beneficial to a wider audience, absolutely. So I'd like to thank you both for taking the time today to engage in this discussion. And I'm hoping we can certainly have many more in the future. So thank you both very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for facilitating, Mike.
Pleasure. I think